looking, reaches, that ball's out, that's live! Back the other way, Sam Hubbard! The Cincinnati Kid! Hubbard's got a convoy! Chased by Andrews! At the 30, the 20, he will score!
To the end zone, down the field, and it is deflected, and gone! Touchdown! A.J. Green!
Over goes back to throw, men are coming late, looks right down the middle, there's Eddie Brown, he has it at the 35 to the 30, he may go, 10-5, touchdown!
Now the Bengals Super Bowl chances rest on his right foot. The kick is up.
Yeah.
It is good.
Corey Dillon, he's gone. The knockout punch, you're looking at it. 65 yards. And they're back to throw as the blitz is on. Goes long, intended for Collinsworth. He has it down to the 20, touchdown. And Chris Collinsworth.
Throwing the long ball. Deep down the field. Trent Johnson's got it. Touchdown, Cincinnati.
Look at Chase go! Oh my goodness, what a gear he just found! Chase for the touchdown! Wow, Chase is on the case!
It is no fluke. It is a fact. The Cincinnati Bengals are headed to Super Bowl 56. The play clock at 3. Shotgun snap. Carr throws into traffic. Intercepted. Jermaine Pratt has the football.
Yeah.
Coffin nails.
Bam, bam, bam! How about that?
Welcome back in, Chatterbox. Bengals back-to-back days, Thursday, February 6th, and Joe Burrow used today to go on a media tour. He used Super Bowl week in Radio Row to push his agenda from FS1's Breakfast Ball to First Take to Up and Adams to the Dan Patrick Show. He hit them all the way down the row today, and he made his opinions known on the Bengals offseason. Not much that he hasn't said before, but really applying pressure to this Bengals front office, very similar to what Trey Hendrickson did yesterday. Two guys that don't usually spend a lot of time in the media, but certainly using the beginning of this offseason to make their opinions known on how this offseason should go for the Bengals. Joe Burrow using these appearances to emphasize how much of a need T. Higgins, Trey Hendrickson, and much more of the Bengals core is. Also led on that he would be willing to restructure his contract at some point down the line. It was a big day of news out of Joe Burrow's mouth, someone we don't usually get to hear from quite as much as we did today.
Yeah, making the media circuit, doing promotion for the FedEx Air and Ground Player of the Year awards that he is nominated for, and unsurprisingly, zero conversation about the FedEx Air and Ground awards.
These guys on Radio Row usually do a good job of getting their plugs in. Joe did not do great at that today. He had one thing on his mind, and it was talking to the Bengals front office.
It's been the same thing that's been on his mind for the last couple months, it feels like. And ultimately, he made a comment at one of the stops along the way that this is one of the most important off seasons in Bengals history. And he is certainly treating it that way. And hopefully the Bengals are also treating it that way.
Absolutely. And this morning started off on Breakfast Ball, and they asked Joe Burrow if he had confidence that the Bengals front office could get this all done this offseason. Obviously, that means Trey Hendrickson, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase. I assume that's what they meant. But Joe Burrow's answer, he said he was confident, but he also threw an extra name in there. Joe Burrow said he is confident that the Bengals can get this done. They have the cap space too, and he wants to make it happen. Everyone involved, Trey, T, Jamar, Mike G, and myself all want to stay together. We have guys that are motivated like that, and I think you can get these things done. That jumped off the page to me early this morning because when we talk about this core of free agents going into this offseason, we've talked on this show about how crucial Mike Gesicki is and how we would like to bring him back to Cincinnati, but he certainly falls into tier 2 when discussing this Bengals offseason. Joe Burrow doesn't seem to agree. Throws him right in there in the mix with T, Jamar, and Trey Hendrickson. I just wonder if the front office views this the same way. We've talked about how Duke Tobin is hesitant to give big money extensions. Does he count Mike Gesicki as one of those big money extensions? I just don't know, but Joe Burrow certainly thinks that Mike Gesicki is a crucial piece of this offseason and wants to have him back as well as Trey and T. Higgins, who we've talked about extensively.
Well, whether he's a big money extension or not, he's still seemingly an important part of this Bengals piece of the puzzle. You know, I mean, you look at this past season, and we talked about it an awful lot after games and throughout each week about how important Mike Gesicki was, especially when guys like T. Higgins weren't out on the field. Gesicki ultimately turned into wide receiver 2 in those scenarios. So Mike, I feel like certainly earned his way into a contract, into being with the Bengals for more than just the 1 year stint that he had. He made $2.5 million this past year. So the question becomes, what is that going to look like in 2025 in order to keep him around?
Yeah.
Does it another $2.5 million contract? Is it a $5 million contract? Is it $8 million? I don't know what his expectations are. And quite frankly, I don't have a good enough grasp on the tight end market to know what he's going to really seek out. And so it'll be interesting to see how Mike Gesicki fits into this. But the biggest piece of it all, obviously, is Joe Burrow publicly recognizing for the first time that he is willing to renegotiate his contract, or to restructure his contract, I guess is more accurate. And I think the reaction to that is probably fair, is that what player wouldn't restructure a contract, which most of the time means guaranteed money up front. I mean, most NFL players are going to do that, Joe Burrow included, especially if it means keeping his guys in the room. I saw an interesting take from Austin Elmore, I think. And I'm interested in your take on this too. He asked the question, how much of this do we think is meant to pressure the Bengals front office? And how much of it do we think is to pressure those other guys on the Bengals to actually uphold their end of the bargain in terms of what they say they want to do to stay together, and not be pressured by their agents, or not be, swayed about what that number ultimately is? So a big push from Joe Burrow this morning, but the biggest piece, obviously, for me is just acknowledging that he is, in fact, willing to restructure in any way.
I think that was a great point by Austin Elmore as well, and I certainly agree. Not something I had thought of off the rip, but Joe Burrow certainly is applying some pressure to Trey and Jamar and T. Higgins to make their contracts work as well. We didn't hear it during the season as much. After that Dallas game, obviously, he hammered home how much T. Higgins was in need, but starting at the Pro Bowl last week, he started to say how everyone needs to make it work for both sides, and that's obviously also including the Bengals front office, and that's what Duke Tobin had been talking about this whole time, is that they have the cap space to make it work, but they can't just pay everyone at the top of their position. So it has to work together. I think there certainly is a piece of this pressure being applied to those guys, that if you keep saying you want to be here, you keep saying you want to play together, you're going to have to take some sacrifices to make all that work. And kudos to Joe for going up there and standing in front and saying, I'm willing to as well. And we could talk about how a restructure is not necessarily a sacrifice, but there's a reason why it's asked of a player by the organization, and it certainly helps the organization out. It's not something Joe would have to do. And for him to be saying out front that he'd be willing to help this organization make this work is a good sign to these other guys that, hey, if he's the example we're going to follow, maybe we take, a little bit off the top as well to make this work for this organization. I think that's what we heard from Trey Hendrickson yesterday. That's what we've heard from T. Higgins every time he's spoken to the media. It's that these guys want to stay together. And I think that's the biggest thing, is every time Joe Burrow keeps applying this public pressure, it's something we haven't really seen before. The front office has been able to kind of skate by in the shadows when they do wrong by their star players. But now with obviously how big social media has gotten since the Carson Palmer debacle years ago, and everything that's happened with the Bengals organization in the Joe Burrow era, there's a lot more eyes on this team and on this front office. And with Joe Burrow going on the media tour today, he continues to, turn the stove up a little bit, heat up the seat for this front office and see what they're going to do. And I think when push comes to shove, he's not giving them an option, which I think is the biggest thing to take away from today, is he's saying, we can get this done. We have to get this done. He said time and time again that the best chance the Bengals have of winning is keeping this core together, and Joe Burrow simply wouldn't be happy if he thought this team wasn't trying to win. And I think that's something that we have to think about this offseason as well.
Yeah, and look, his next stop on his little media circuit was ESPN's First Take this morning, and on that show, he said, and you put out a graphic, I think, we have some great players that have done great things and deserve to be paid. They're going to be paid what they're worth, whether we do it or somebody else. I hope we do it. Yeah. And the truth of the matter is that, all four of these guys could, Joe Burrow's under contract, but the other three guys could all go elsewhere and get paid what they need to get paid in order to play in the NFL. That's true. And that's where the conversation goes of how much of these behind the scenes conversations that these players have had are really going to come to fruition, right? Yeah, they all say they want to stay together. They all say that they are willing to make it work in whatever way that means. We've seen the Kansas City Chiefs do this with Patrick Mahomes restructuring his contract, many other quarterbacks restructuring contracts along the way. So I'm sure that Joe's willing to do that and to take the guaranteed money as signing bonus or whatever it may be. But ultimately, the pressure is on all four of them to make this happen, along with the Bengals front office.
Yeah.
And whether that's Duke Tobin or Troy and Katie, it doesn't really matter. The truth of the matter is that all four of them could get paid by any team in the NFL. And at this point, the Bengals have the upper hand because they have the opportunity to keep them all together. And no other team right now can offer that same incentive to keep all four of them together. And that's the Cincinnati Bengals. And nobody else can do that regardless of how hard they try, because Joe Burrow is locked in as a Cincinnati Bengal for the foreseeable future.
Something else Joe Burrow recognized on First Take today is that the importance of the young guys in the draft, if they do lock in these big pieces. He said, we need our young guys to come on. We need to draft well. We need guys to come in and produce immediately. We don't have time to wait around. And that's a direct shot at Duke Tobin for how these last couple years have gone, this Bengals front office as a whole, for how these last couple years have gone in free agency and in the draft. It just hasn't been good enough. And once you lock in a T. Higgins, a Trey Hendrickson, a Jamar Chase, and a Joe Burrow, you have to draft. If you look at the teams in the Super Bowl right now, we talk about the Eagles roster a lot. Most of their starters are from the draft. They're playing on rookie contracts. They were able to work out extensions while they were there, play with money. Hitting in the draft and not having to go to free agency is how you get here with multiple players on big-time contracts. Joe Burrow knows that, and he's making that well aware before they go into the draft this season. This 2025 draft is just as important as a lot of these extensions and free agency signings because it's going to set the foundation for what we can build around in Cincinnati on the defensive side of the football, and even with some of the holes we have on offense, specifically the offensive line. After First Take, Joe moved over to Kay Adams' show and kept talking about a lot of the same things, said that he would be willing to restructure, but the thing that really jumped out to me on this show was Kay asked him if he was inserting himself in the situation, and very quickly, Joe said that he was not. Joe said that this is part of his job. Part of the job of the quarterback of an organization is figuring out ways to make the team better and working with the front office. I think that last couple words right there really jumped off the page to me. Working with the front office. We talked about yesterday how the communication with Trey Hendrickson really made us upset with how that story went down. And here for Joe Burrow to say openly that he's working with the front office to get this offseason done, maybe the communication just hasn't trickled down quite enough to Trey Hendrickson. If Joe Burrow's working hand in hand with Duke Tobin and the players and trying to get this done and aiding the communication of all these sides together, I think that's a great place to be. And a perfect liaison for that role between the two levels would be Joe Burrow, and would certainly make this process a little bit easier.
I mean, all of that may be true, but Trey Hendrickson's agent also just yesterday came out and said that he's planning on meeting with the Bengals next week. And at that point feels like he'll have a better idea of whether this is moving towards an extension or towards a trade. And Harold Lewis, his agent, made the comment that the ultimate goal is to make him a Bengal for the long term. So it may be true. It may not be true. I think what we have seen is that Joe Burrow has gotten his contract done. Right. So we know that he and his agent have been able to work with this front office to get a deal done. Obviously, there was the whole conversation that we had several weeks ago, or maybe even a couple of months ago at this point, about T. Higgins moving on from his agent, David Mulligetta, and moving away from him, knowing the history that the Bengals have with Mulligetta and their inability to really strike long-term agreements. So maybe it is one of those things where Joe feels comfortable that, hey, myself, the agents, we're all in lockstep with the front office to make this happen. It'll be interesting to see, but combine those comments about communicating with the front office with his comments about the draft and the need to be able to hit on the draft. It'll be interesting to see what kind of fingerprint Joe has on this year's draft, if any. Hopefully there won't be a whole lot of holes on the offensive side of the ball to need to be filled outside of the guard position. I think if you sign your free agents and you sign T and Jamar, then there won't be a whole lot of holes where you have to address, and they can really focus on the defensive side of the ball. But it'll be interesting to see, does Joe have a word, and maybe a guard is higher on their board than maybe had been anticipated, or whatever it may be. The other interesting thing to think about is the Bengals made the decision to move away from Lou Anarumo this offseason. Lou to his own detriment, potentially, really relied on some veteran players that didn't necessarily perform at the level where the Bengals needed them to perform in order to get to the Super Bowl. Mm-hmm. And it took him a little bit longer, I think, than maybe necessary to move away from those veteran players. So from Joe's perspective, whether that was Lou being reliant on veterans or just not having faith in the young guys, either way, read it however you want. But the truth of the matter is that this draft and this Bengals core is set up for success, but they have to hit in the draft in order to make it work. You can only plug so many holes, and to Duke's point, you can only pay so many players at the top of their position.
Speaking of paying players at the top of the position, obviously a lot of the conversation around the Bengals today has been from quotes from Joe Burrow and everything else he's been saying. But James Palmer on BR's NFL Insider Notebook said right now there's a buzz around Radio Row that there's a greater chance of T. Higgins returning to Cincinnati than going anywhere else. That's really the talk here in New Orleans. There's a greater chance of him in Cincinnati than hitting the open market. And that seems like a shift in terms of national media. We've talked about T. Higgins staying in Cincinnati for a while. But it seems like in every kind of free agency ranking or any free agency talk on national media, T. Higgins is number one and talked about going elsewhere. They've shot down the idea of paying both wide receivers in Cincinnati, talking about First Take and, First Things First and all the national media shows. This is the first time I've really heard it from outside of Cincinnati that it seems like T. Higgins is staying, and that's good news in the middle of February, early February.
Yeah, and I think it's really the first time that we've heard, at least from some sort of insider information, that it was leaning that way. I think a lot of us felt that it was leaning that way, and even I think the Vegas odds are leaning that way as well. But it was good to hear from an insider that actually has sources that are telling him that, hey, we're hearing T's also going to be back in Cincinnati next year. All of this speculation that we have done, that the media has done about, maybe the Patriots are a good fit and are going to be all in for T. Higgins, or the Bengals can't possibly sign all of these guys and have them on contracts in 2025, and all of this different speculation. And then obviously the speculation that we just talked about with David Mulligetta moving away from being T's agent, all of it lines up. So yeah, I think the big piece here is that all of that speculation sounds like it is accurate and sounds like it's true, but is that coming from the Bengals side? Is that coming from T. Higgins' side? Is that coming from Joe Burrow? We don't really know where it's coming from. But if other GMs are getting it in their mind that T. Higgins is going to be a Bengal for the long term, that can definitely play in the Bengals' favor as they work through what this offseason looks like for them.
There's no question about it, and we know if Joe Burrow gets a microphone, he'll continue to tell them how important it is that they extend T. Higgins. And it's been a big Super Bowl week for Bengals in terms of news, and hopefully we're playing back in it soon, and we don't have to worry about our guys recruiting free agents on Radio Row. But if there's any more Bengals news, you know where to find us. Thanks for watching today, guys. That's going to do it for Chatterbox Bengals. Jacob Tissett, Craig Sandlin, Houday. We'll see you guys next time.